One wrong turn. That's all it took for a night out to become a permanent mystery. Before we begin this descent into the shadows, where are you watching from? Drop your city in the comments right now. This is the story of Kenneka Jenkins and the frozen questions that still haunt the internet. In September 2017, 19-year-old Kenneka Jenkins left her home in Chicago late on a Friday evening, heading to a party at the Crowne Plaza Chicago O'Hare in Rosemont, Illinois. She arrived at the hotel around 1:13 a.m., accompanied by friends. In the early morning hours of September 9th, hotel security cameras recorded her exiting a lower-level elevator at 3:25 a.m. The footage showed her walking unsteadily through hallways, appearing disoriented. Around 3:30 to 3:32 a.m., she was seen passing through a first-floor kitchen. The surveillance videos did not capture her entering the freezer located in that kitchen area. Later that morning, when friends could not account for her whereabouts, her family began to make inquiries at the hotel. By 7:14 a.m., her mother contacted the Rosemont Public Safety Department to report that she could not find her daughter. At 12:46 p.m., Jenkins' sister filed a missing person report. Rosemont police officers began searching the hotel and reviewing video footage. The search continued into the next day. At 12:25 a.m. on September 10th, a hotel employee discovered Jenkins' body inside a walk-in freezer, itself located within a walk-in cooler in an unused kitchen area. Medical personnel pronounced her dead at the scene, and by 3:08 a.m., an investigator from the Cook County Medical Examiner's office had arrived. At 5:10 a.m., the body was transported to the medical examiner's office. After the family was given a chance to view her before removal, the Cook County Medical Examiner released findings on October 6th. The cause of death was listed as hypothermia, with the manner ruled accidental. Her blood alcohol concentration was 0.112, and toxicology tests showed the presence of topiramate, a medication prescribed for seizures and migraines. The autopsy noted mucosal erosions consistent with hypothermia, along with minor abrasions on her right ankle and a contusion on her right leg, but no evidence of other external or internal trauma. On October 20th, 2017, the Rosemont Public Safety Department publicly announced the closure of its investigation, stating that no evidence of foul play had been found. Officials emphasized that the freezer's internal safety release was working properly and that surveillance cameras simply had not covered the point of freezer entry. Years later, in December 2023, court records disclosed a $10 million settlement reached in a wrongful death lawsuit filed by Jenkins' family against the hotel, its security providers, and associated restaurant operations. The settlement was divided among family members according to filings. When investigators reconstructed Jenkins' movements, they relied on dozens of video clips collected from cameras throughout the hotel. The footage did not cover every area, and police acknowledged that there were blind spots, including the exact entrance to the freezer where she was found. However, the sequence of clips available consistently showed her alone after approximately 3:25 a.m., disoriented, and at no point did she appear accompanied by others. The hotel's freezer and cooler units were located in a section of the kitchen that was not being used for active food preparation at the time. The freezer itself was kept at a temperature low enough to cause rapid hypothermia. Rosemont police later clarified that the freezer door had an internal safety release handle designed to allow someone trapped inside to exit. During the investigation, that mechanism was tested and reported to be functioning. The Cook County Medical Examiner's office performed both a full autopsy and a toxicology screen. In addition to her blood alcohol concentration of 0.112, Jenkins had caffeine and nicotine in her system, but these substances were not listed as significant contributors. The topiramate level detected was consistent with therapeutic use, but would have enhanced the impairing effects of alcohol, particularly since she had no prescription for the drug. At the scene, crime lab technicians took photographs and secured evidence. Their notes described Jenkins' clothing as being consistent with what she had been wearing in surveillance clips: jeans, a jean jacket, and white sneakers. One shoe was partially off when she was found. The abrasions on her ankle and contusion on her leg were minor and not consistent with assault, according to the autopsy report. There were no defensive wounds. Rosemont Public Safety Department issued a detailed timetable of events in its October 20th press release. It included not just the discovery of the body, but also every call made by family members to police, each report filed, and the timing of the search efforts. The department emphasized that officers reviewed 9 hours of surveillance footage before locating Jenkins in the recordings. The case drew significant public attention immediately after her death was announced. The fact that she was missing for more than 20 hours before discovery raised widespread questions. But Rosemont officials maintained that searches had been conducted systematically, with security officers and police coordinating throughout. The surveillance system of the Crowne Plaza Chicago O'Hare became one of the most scrutinized elements of the investigation. The hotel operated a network of cameras in public and service areas, but like most commercial properties, it did not provide full coverage of every possible location. The timeline of Jenkins' final movements was reconstructed from this partial surveillance. After 3:25 a.m., cameras documented her in lower-level hallways, then stumbling past an elevator lobby, eventually entering a first-floor kitchen space that was unoccupied. At approximately 3:32 a.m., she was seen passing through the visible portion of that kitchen. The footage then ended, not because the recording stopped, but because no camera had been installed to face the freezer door. This absence of coverage left the exact moment she entered the freezer undocumented. When the Rosemont Public Safety Department released the relevant footage on September 15, 2017, they included multiple clips showing Jenkins' disorientation. Viewers saw her veer into walls, stumble, and appear to lose her sense of direction. Critics of the investigation often pointed to the lack of footage showing the freezer entry as suspicious, but police explained that no such camera angle existed. The building's camera system had not been designed with continuous coverage of every kitchen door or storage area. Attention also focused on the freezer itself. It was located within a walk-in cooler, requiring 2 doors to be opened to reach the space where Jenkins was discovered. The freezer had been part of a kitchen that was not in active service during the period in question. Inside, the temperature was maintained well below freezing, a condition that can produce incapacitating hypothermia within an hour. Rosemont officials later stated that the door was equipped with an internal safety release mechanism, sometimes called a panic bar or push release, which allows someone inside to escape. During the investigation, technicians confirmed that this release mechanism was operational at the time. Police concluded that Jenkins, in her impaired and disoriented state, either did not recognize the release or was unable to locate or operate it effectively once trapped. The toxicology analysis conducted by the Cook County Medical Examiner added another technical layer. Jenkins' blood alcohol concentration measured 0.112, which, according to forensic standards, would produce significant impairment, particularly in balance, judgment, and reaction time. The presence of topiramate complicated the picture further. While not a sedative in itself, the drug is known to cause dizziness, double vision, and confusion, and when combined with alcohol, these effects are magnified. Investigators could not determine how Jenkins ingested the medication, as she did not have a prescription. Still, the combination provided a medical explanation for the behaviors seen on video: staggering, loss of coordination, and difficulty with orientation. The search process within the hotel also revealed technical constraints. When Jenkins' family first reported her missing, police did not immediately access every area of the building. Standard procedure in missing person cases requires gathering initial information, reviewing security footage, and then expanding physical searches. In this case, the family pressed staff and police to widen the search more quickly, but the Rosemont Public Safety Department's timeline shows that hours passed before officers reviewed enough video to identify Jenkins' path into the first-floor kitchen. Once that discovery was made, staff were sent to check those spaces again. Only then, at 12:25 a.m. on September 10th, did a hotel employee open the cooler and freezer, leading to the discovery of her body. Forensic pathologists also examined the injuries noted on Jenkins' body. These included a small abrasion on the right ankle and a contusion on the right leg. No evidence of physical struggle, assault, or defensive wounds was found. The marks were considered minor and consistent with contact injuries that could occur from falling or bumping into objects while impaired. Importantly, The absence of internal trauma or external signs of force reinforced the conclusion that no assault had taken place. The temperature inside the freezer provided another technical element. Hypothermia is a well-documented medical condition that develops when the body loses heat faster than it can produce it. In freezing environments, onset can be rapid, particularly in individuals under the influence of alcohol. Alcohol causes vasodilation, which increases heat loss, and also dulls the shivering response that helps generate body heat. Medical examiners cited these physiological effects in explaining why Jenkins would have been unable to survive for long once inside the freezer. The mucosal erosions found in her stomach lining were also consistent with hypothermia, an established autopsy finding in similar cases. The Rosemont police report addressed the issue of time lost in locating Jenkins. According to their public statement, a total of 9 hours of video had to be reviewed before her route through the hotel was reconstructed. The blind spots in camera coverage contributed to delays in pinpointing her exact location. The family questioned why the freezer area was not searched earlier, but officials maintained that the search was systematic and based on available information at each stage. This phase of the case demonstrated how technical systems, camera placement, freezer design, toxicological effects, and search protocols intersected in a way that left critical moments undocumented. Each element was individually explained by investigators, yet together they created gaps that fueled public skepticism. The absence of footage showing her entering the freezer, the delay in searching that area, and the presence of a working safety release device that went unused all became focal points of debate. The question of the freezer's safety mechanisms was one of the first technical issues Rosemont officials addressed. The unit, manufactured with a standard push-release handle, had been installed to meet commercial kitchen codes requiring that a person trapped inside be able to exit without assistance. After Jenkins' body was found, investigators from the Rosemont Public Safety Department inspected the freezer. They opened and closed the door multiple times, documenting that the internal release worked as designed. A police spokesperson later emphasized this point in press briefings, noting that the mechanism was functional. The finding did not change the conclusion that Jenkins had been unable to escape, but it shifted focus to her condition, impaired judgment and motor skills that likely prevented her from recognizing or operating the release. Video analysis was another demanding technical component. Investigators had to collect and review recordings from numerous cameras across multiple levels of the hotel. According to the police timeline, 9 hours of footage were analyzed to trace Jenkins' path. Each clip was examined, logged, and then pieced together to reconstruct her movements. The absence of a camera directed toward the freezer door meant that the final step, her entry into the freezer, was not captured. While investigators noted that camera coverage gaps are common in commercial buildings, this absence became one of the most discussed aspects of the case once the videos were released publicly. The toxicology report produced by the Cook County Medical Examiner's Office underwent the same scrutiny. Jenkins' blood alcohol concentration was confirmed at 0.112 grams per deciliter, which falls within a range known to impair balance, coordination, and cognitive processing. The presence of topiramate complicated matters. The levels detected were not toxic but were consistent with therapeutic doses. Without a prescription history, investigators could not determine how the drug entered her system. The interaction between alcohol and topiramate is clinically significant. Both substances depress central nervous system function, and topiramate in particular is known to impair spatial orientation and decision-making. These combined effects provided a medical explanation for the staggering gait, delayed reactions, and apparent confusion seen on surveillance. Search procedures in the hotel became another focal point. Once Jenkins was reported missing, hotel staff and Rosemont officers began checking common areas, stairwells, and hallways. The family insisted that the freezer area should have been searched earlier. Police explained that the search had been conducted in stages, beginning with likely areas such as rooms, corridors, and lobbies, before expanding to less traffic service spaces. The video review, conducted concurrently, was critical in narrowing down the search. When officers finally identified Jenkins on tape entering the unused kitchen, they directed staff to inspect that section again. It was during this follow-up check, at 12:25 a.m. on September 10th, that a hotel employee discovered her inside the freezer. At the autopsy, the findings supported the technical explanations already given. Hypothermia was listed as the primary cause of death. The medical examiner described mucosal erosions in her stomach, an effect associated with low body temperature. Minor abrasions and a bruise were documented but were not indicative of a struggle. Importantly, there were no injuries that suggested assault or restraint. The evidence pointed to environmental factors, intoxication, and the absence of intervention rather than foul play. The technical record established by investigators was clear. The freezer was cold enough to induce hypothermia quickly. The release handle was working. The surveillance cameras did not capture every corner of the building, and the impairing effects of alcohol and medication combined to leave Jenkins vulnerable. Yet it was precisely the convergence of these details, functioning equipment unused, missing camera angles, and delayed discovery, that led to persistent questions outside the official findings. From the beginning, the disappearance of Kenneka Jenkins was framed not just as a technical mystery but as a crisis for her family. Teresa Martin, her mother, was the first to raise alarm after repeated phone calls to her daughter went unanswered. When Martin arrived at the Crowne Plaza on the morning of September 9th, she pressed hotel staff for assistance. In later interviews with the Chicago Tribune and local TV stations, she described her frustration at being told that she had to file a missing person report with police before staff could search restricted areas. Martin's account emphasized her sense of urgency, as she knew her daughter would not have left the hotel voluntarily without her phone or car keys. Jenkins' friends, who had attended the 9th floor party with her, also gave statements. They recalled her drinking and becoming visibly intoxicated. Some left the party before she did, and others reported losing track of her after she left the room. Later, when video footage emerged, these accounts aligned with what the cameras showed. Jenkins wandering alone, appearing confused. In the days following her death, friends faced harsh public scrutiny, particularly online, but they consistently maintained that they had not accompanied her into the kitchen or freezer areas. Hotel staff who participated in the search described a process that became more urgent as the hours passed. Security officers initially checked guest floors and hallways after the missing person report was filed at 12:46 p.m. They returned repeatedly to camera footage to trace movements, but because the system was not designed for rapid retrieval, this took time. According to Rosemont officials, it was only after seeing her on video in the kitchen that staff directed searches into that space. The employee who discovered Jenkins' body at 12:25 a.m. on September 10th was never identified publicly, but was described in police records as part of the hotel's team responding to police requests. Police officers who briefed the press after the discovery noted that Jenkins was found lying on her side in the freezer. They also described the reactions of family members who had been at the hotel during the search. According to news reports, Martin and relatives were allowed to view her body before it was transported to the medical examiner's office. In later interviews, Martin recounted this as one of the most painful moments of her life, emphasizing that she had begged hotel staff for faster action hours earlier. Community reactions were immediate. Friends and neighbors in Chicago's West Side described Jenkins as a caring young woman, known for helping her mother care for younger siblings. At vigils and protests held outside the hotel, supporters repeated the family's questions about why it had taken so long to find her and why the freezer had not been checked sooner. These gatherings were widely covered by local and national outlets, amplifying the human grief that surrounded the case. The release of surveillance footage 6 days later, on September 15th, created another wave of responses. Family members were shown the videos in private before they were made public. Martin later said in interviews that watching her daughter stumble aimlessly through the hotel's halls and kitchen was devastating, describing it as seeing her baby die on screen. Activists who attended the screenings echoed her pain, saying the footage raised as many questions as it answered. The Cook County Medical Examiner's report was delivered not only as a technical document but also as a point of human tension. When officials announced the cause of death as hypothermia, with no signs of foul play, Martin voiced skepticism. In statements given to reporters, she insisted that she wanted further investigation, stating that she could not understand how her daughter would have been able to enter the freezer alone. Her doubt resonated with many community members, fueling ongoing vigils and demonstrations. Police officers faced questions not just about the freezer and surveillance, but also about their handling of the family. Rosemont Public Safety Chief Donald Stevens III defended his department's actions, saying the search had been systematic and professional. He expressed sympathy for the family but stood by the conclusion that the death was accidental. Other officials echoed this stance, emphasizing that the internal safety release on the freezer had been tested and that Jenkins had not been locked inside by another person. Civil proceedings years later revealed the depth of the family's sense of loss. In filings for the wrongful death lawsuit, lawyers representing Jenkins' relatives argued that the hotel had been negligent in its security and search procedures. The suit included accounts from family members describing their repeated pleas for a thorough search of the property. The December 2023 settlement acknowledged the impact of these arguments, though the defendants did not admit liability. Through these human accounts, the case became more than a sequence of technical findings. For the family, it was a story of unanswered pleas and unbearable grief. For friends, it was a reminder of a night that spiraled out of their control. For hotel staff and police, it was a test of protocols under intense scrutiny. And for the broader community, it became a symbol of mistrust in institutions, where the human experience of loss and doubt outweighed the comfort of official explanations. When the search for Kenneka Jenkins was still unfolding, the emotions of those closest to her were palpable. Teresa Martin, her mother, recounted how she first began receiving phone calls from her daughter's friends early in the morning of September 9th. They told her they could not find Kenneka and that her belongings, including her cell phone and car keys, were still with them. Martin's instincts told her something was wrong. She later told reporters, "My baby wouldn't just leave without her phone. She wouldn't leave without calling me." Martin drove to the Crowne Plaza Chicago O'Hare that morning. In interviews with the Chicago Tribune and on television, she described walking the lobby and pressing hotel employees for help. She asked to see security footage and pleaded for staff to search restricted areas, including the kitchens. According to her account, she was told that staff could not release footage without police involvement. That barrier, she would later say, haunted her. The idea that precious hours had been lost because she was forced to wait. Her sister, who filed the official missing person report with Rosemont police at 12:46 p.m., echoed her concerns. Family members recalled feeling powerless as time dragged on, knowing that Kenneka had not returned home, but not seeing immediate results from the hotel search. They kept returning to the front desk, asking for updates. Among Kenneka's friends, the atmosphere was heavy with confusion and guilt. They had joined her at the hotel party the night before, many of them teenagers and young adults themselves. In their statements to reporters, some admitted they were drinking and distracted. One recalled that Jenkins was tipsy, but nothing out of the ordinary. Another described her as too drunk to drive. They told police and media that they assumed she had stepped away to use the restroom or get air, and when she did not return, they at first thought she might have left the room on her own. When video later showed her staggering through hallways and kitchens, those who knew her said they recognized the disorientation. "That's how she gets when she drinks too much," one friend admitted in a TV interview. The release of the video to the public intensified scrutiny of those friends. Online commentators accused them of negligence, and conspiracy theories flourished, but the friends consistently denied luring or abandoning her. They pointed to the hotel's responsibility and the delay in searching the freezer. For them, the grief of losing a friend was compounded by suspicion from strangers. Hotel staff members faced their own wave of criticism. According to statements from the Rosemont Public Safety Department, employees assisted police with the search as soon as the missing person report was filed. Security officers checked guest floors, stairwells, and common areas. Yet their accounts admitted that they did not immediately open the unused kitchen's freezer because there was no initial reason to suspect anyone had gone inside. For the employee who eventually found Jenkins, the discovery was described in police notes as deeply upsetting. Although the individual's name was not released publicly, officials confirmed that the staffer was shaken by the sight and immediately notified authorities. The police themselves became central figures in the narrative of human response. Chief Donald Stevens III, head of the Rosemont Public Safety Department, addressed the press multiple times. He expressed condolences to the family but defended the conduct of his officers, stressing that their search had been systematic and thorough. "This was a tragic accident," he said in an October 2017 press briefing, "but it was not the result of foul play." His words were meant to reassure, but for the family and many community members, they felt premature. For Teresa Martin, official reassurances did not erase her doubts. She spoke to reporters outside the hotel during vigils, repeating her disbelief that her daughter would have walked into the freezer alone. At times, she expressed suspicion about how quickly authorities had labeled the death an accident. At a rally, she told the crowd, "I want answers. I don't want nobody to cover up anything." Her public grief turned her into a voice for transparency, echoing the broader mistrust that others in the community felt toward institutions. The vigils themselves became major human events. In the days after Jenkins was found, hundreds gathered outside the hotel. They lit candles, held signs, and chanted her name. Many brought flowers, teddy bears, and handwritten notes. Community activists from Chicago joined the demonstrations, framing the case within a larger pattern of young black women disappearing or being found dead without what they saw as sufficient urgency from authorities. The chants and speeches at these vigils often reflected not just sorrow but also anger. Protesters demanded that surveillance tapes be released, that the family be given access to all evidence, and that the hotel be held accountable for what they viewed as negligence. When the Cook County Medical Examiner released its findings on October 6th, stating that the cause of death was hypothermia and the manner accidental, reactions were divided. For police and officials, the report confirmed their preliminary conclusions. For Martin and many community members, it raised more questions. Martin spoke again to reporters, saying, "I don't believe it. I still want to know what happened to my baby." Her persistence kept the case in headlines even after the official closure. Journalists covering the story documented the reactions of ordinary citizens as well. Social media erupted with commentary, much of it skeptical of the official narrative. Hashtags carrying Jenkins' name spread across platforms, drawing attention from beyond Chicago. People posted videos, theories, and emotional tributes, treating her death as symbolic of broader systemic issues. Years later, when the wrongful death lawsuit brought by Jenkins' family reached a settlement in December 2023, court records included further family accounts. They described the trauma of waiting nearly a full day before her body was found, the lasting grief of losing a daughter and sister, and the anguish of knowing she had been in the hotel while they were searching. Although the settlement did not involve an admission of wrongdoing by the hotel, the size of the agreement, $10 million, reflected the seriousness of the family's claims. In human terms, the case was more than a technical story about surveillance cameras, toxicology, and search timelines. It was about a mother's desperation, friends' feelings of helplessness, workers haunted by what they found, police trying to defend their professionalism under suspicion, and a community channeling grief into protest. Each account revealed a layer of lived experience that statistics and forensic data alone could not convey. From the earliest hours of the investigation into Kenneka Jenkins' disappearance, questions emerged about the consistency of the official account. The Rosemont Public Safety Department presented its timeline as precise and systematic, yet family members and community advocates noted discrepancies between what was said publicly and what appeared in available records. One of the most debated issues was the timeline of the search. According to Rosemont police, officers began reviewing security footage after Jenkins' sister filed a missing person report at 12:46 p.m. on September 9th. The official press release stated that 9 hours of footage were reviewed before investigators located her in the recordings. Yet family members said they repeatedly urged staff and police to check the kitchens earlier that day, long before midnight. For them, the fact that her body was found at 12:25 a.m. on September 10th, more than 20 hours after she was last seen, contradicted assurances that the search had been systematic and thorough. The discrepancy was not in whether the search happened, but in its pace and prioritization. Another area of contention involved the hotel's handling of surveillance footage. Police stated that the video system had to be reviewed manually, which contributed to delays. But activists pointed out that by the time the footage was released on September 15th, it appeared edited, with certain clips stitched together or presented without sound. Officials explained that the videos were given in segments because that was how the system stored them, but the presentation fueled suspicion. Viewers noted abrupt cuts and transitions. Police maintained that no manipulation occurred, yet the format of release allowed discrepancies in perception to flourish. The freezer safety mechanism became another point of conflict. Rosemont officials confirmed that the internal release handle was functional when tested after Jenkins' death. This detail was included in their October 20th statement closing the case. But for many observers, it raised more questions than it answered. If the handle worked, why hadn't Jenkins used it? The official explanation pointed to her intoxicated and medicated state, which could have left her too disoriented to recognize or operate the mechanism. Family members, however, said this reasoning felt like speculation. They questioned whether the handle was tested under the exact same conditions present on the night of her death, including lighting, temperature, and the freezer's maintenance status. The cause and manner of death declared by the Cook County Medical Examiner, hypothermia accidental, were presented as final. Yet the report itself contained details that many seized upon. The autopsy described a bruise on Jenkins' leg and an abrasion on her ankle, both minor, but enough to spark debate. Officials explained these as consistent with stumbling or bumping into objects while intoxicated, but some family members and supporters pointed to them as potential evidence of struggle. The medical examiner's office insisted there were no signs of assault, but the existence of any injury at all created a gap between clinical language and public interpretation. Public statements by police added further layers of discrepancy. Chief Donald Stevens III repeatedly stressed that no foul play was evident and that the investigation was complete. Yet he also admitted that the cameras did not capture Jenkins entering the freezer, only moving through the kitchen area minutes earlier. To him, this absence was simply a function of camera placement, but to critics it was a glaring gap. The contradiction lay in the tone. Officials described the case as resolved, while simultaneously acknowledging that the single most critical moment, the entry into the freezer, had not been directly observed. Another official inconsistency appeared in discussions of hotel cooperation. Rosemont police said the hotel worked closely with them throughout the investigation, but family members reported feeling resisted when they first asked staff to search restricted areas. Hotel management never gave extensive public statements, but in court filings years later, their defense emphasized adherence to normal procedure. The family, however, argued that normal procedure should have given way to urgency once a young woman was reported missing. The difference in perspectives created an enduring sense of contradiction. One side pointed to rules and process, the other to instinct and urgency. Community reactions to these discrepancies were captured in protests and media coverage. At vigils outside the hotel, speakers accused authorities of dismissing the family's concerns. They say it was an accident, one protester told reporters, but they can't even show how she went in. The chant "Justice for Kenneka" was rooted less in belief of a specific alternative explanation than in dissatisfaction with the official one. The discrepancy here was not only factual but emotional, a gulf between what the public needed for closure and what officials were able or willing to provide. Even the final closure of the case on October 20th, 2017, carried contradictions. The press release detailed a timeline of Jenkins' last known movements, the medical findings, and the functionality of the freezer door. Yet, in the very same document, police acknowledged the existence of unanswered questions about why Jenkins ended up where she did. The release was meant to conclude the investigation, but by admitting to gaps, it also fueled continued doubt. Years later, during the wrongful death lawsuit, these discrepancies reemerged. The family's legal filings highlighted what they saw as failures: delayed searches, inadequate security measures, and poor communication with relatives. The hotel and security companies denied liability, but their agreement to settle for $10 million suggested a recognition that the official story alone had not quelled questions. Taken together, the official discrepancies in the Jenkins case were not outright contradictions of fact, but rather tensions between what was known, what was explained, and what was believed. Police said the search was thorough, yet the family felt ignored. Officials said the videos were unaltered, yet viewers saw gaps. The medical examiner said injuries were minor, yet supporters saw possible signs of foul play. The freezer release was functional, yet Jenkins did not escape. Each point was explained, but none fully resolved. These gaps ensured that the case remained unsettled in the public imagination, despite being officially closed. The account of Kenneka Jenkins' death became defined as much by what was said officially as by what was left unsaid. Each new statement released by authorities or the hotel opened the door to new questions, creating a web of inconsistencies that deepened public skepticism. One area of discrepancy arose in the early police communications on September 10th, after Jenkins' body was discovered. Initial reports to the media described her as being found in a walk-in cooler, but later statements clarified it was actually the freezer compartment of the cooler unit, which was colder and more hazardous. While seemingly minor, the imprecision mattered. For the family, it raised doubts about whether the scene was fully understood, and for the public, it signaled either carelessness or deliberate vagueness. The handling of the 911 calls from Jenkins' mother and friends also revealed contradictions. Police reports later confirmed that Martin had made multiple attempts to involve officers and had even arrived at the hotel before police formally opened the case. Yet early press coverage, based on official statements, framed the timeline as though the search began only after law enforcement became aware. The omission of Martin's persistence gave the impression that officials were leading the process from the start, when in reality it was the family who had pressed for urgency. A separate inconsistency came from autopsy language versus public interpretation. The Cook County Medical Examiner's report listed hypothermia as the cause of death, complicated by alcohol and topiramate intoxication. But the phrasing consistent with exposure to cold created confusion when quoted in media stories. Some readers understood consistent with as uncertain, even though in forensic context it was a precise conclusion. Officials insisted the science was clear. Critics argued that if the language could be misread, it wasn't clear enough. This discrepancy between technical phrasing and lay interpretation widened the gulf between authorities and the public. The issue of video surveillance offered some of the most persistent contradictions. Police maintained that the footage showed Jenkins alone after 3:25 a.m., stumbling and disoriented. Yet the clips released publicly were presented in short, silent segments, without timestamps superimposed on the images. When community members slowed or replayed the videos, they pointed to moments where shadows or reflections appeared ambiguous, suggesting possible tampering or missing frames. Officials denied editing but admitted that the hotel system did not record continuous streams. The contradiction wasn't just about facts, it was about trust. Officials relied on the technical limits of the system, while the public relied on visible gaps as proof of something hidden. Another set of discrepancies surrounded staff procedures and policies. The hotel and security company stated that it was standard practice not to access restricted areas without clear cause or police authorization. Yet in depositions later filed as part of the wrongful death lawsuit, security employees acknowledged that on some occasions, staff had entered similar areas when guests were missing or unaccounted for. The inconsistency raised the question: was the refusal to open the kitchen earlier a matter of strict protocol, or a discretionary decision that delayed discovery? The functionality of the freezer door also carried conflicting details. Police said the safety release was tested and working. However, in the family's lawsuit, attorneys argued that the release mechanism was not reasonably visible or intuitive, especially for someone intoxicated. Maintenance records for the unit were not released in detail, leaving unanswered questions about its condition before and after the incident. The contradiction was less about whether the mechanism worked, and more about whether it was practical to expect Jenkins to recognize and operate it under her circumstances. When the Rosemont Public Safety Department issued its October 20, 2017 final report, it was meant to close the matter. But the document itself acknowledged that there is no video footage of Ms. Jenkins entering the freezer. The report simultaneously declared the case complete and admitted the central moment was undocumented. This paradox became one of the most cited examples of the official narrative's weakness. Critics argued, how could a conclusion be definitive if the critical act was unseen? Further contradictions appeared in how officials described family cooperation. Police said they maintained constant communication with Jenkins' relatives during the search. Yet Martin, in public statements, described long gaps where she felt uninformed, ignored, or brushed aside. Both accounts could be true in their own ways. Police may have believed updates were being given, but the family did not feel meaningfully included. Still, the conflicting portrayals became another source of mistrust. The lawsuit filings years later introduced another layer of discrepancy. While the hotel and security company admitted no wrongdoing, their settlement agreement of $10 million suggested recognition of risk or exposure. Officials framed it as a business decision, not an admission. The family interpreted it as tacit acknowledgement that protocols had failed. The contradiction lay not in the dollar figure, but in the message it sent. Formally, no fault. Symbolically, responsibility. Even the public framing of the case by different agencies carried contradictions. The Cook County Medical Examiner consistently described the manner of death as accidental. Rosemont police echoed that conclusion, but activists and legal advocates argued that calling it accidental prematurely erased systemic failures. The slow search, the restricted access, the surveillance blind spots. The official designation closed the file, but in doing so it created an enduring discrepancy between bureaucratic closure and community perception of injustice. Over time, these discrepancies hardened into two parallel narratives. One official, documented in reports and statements. The other communal, rooted in lived experience and skepticism. Where the official side saw procedure, the community saw neglect. Where officials saw an accident, the family saw unanswered questions. The distance between the two ensured that the case, though closed on paper, remained unresolved in public memory. The death of Kenneka Jenkins quickly left the confines of Rosemont, Illinois, and became a story of national and even international interest. From the moment news broke that a 19-year-old woman had been found dead in a hotel freezer, the case struck a nerve that went far beyond the suburban hotel where it occurred. The combination of a young victim, unanswered questions, and the circulation of partial video footage created a story that was uniquely suited to the age of social media and 24-hour news. Local Chicago outlets were among the first to cover the discovery, reporting the basic facts. Jenkins had been attending a party, had gone missing, and was found nearly a full day later in a freezer. These early accounts, particularly from the Chicago Tribune and Chicago Sun-Times, were cautious, citing only what police confirmed. But almost immediately, the story began to take on a different life online. On Facebook, live videos from inside the hotel room party surfaced, originally recorded by attendees. Viewers began scrutinizing them frame by frame, listening to background noises, searching for what they believed were cries for help or hidden clues. These videos spread rapidly, amassing hundreds of thousands of views. Twitter users built threads compiling timelines, theorizing about conspiracies, and highlighting inconsistencies between what the family said, what the police reported, and what the footage appeared to show. Within days, hashtags bearing Jenkins' name were trending, and people far removed from Chicago began to feel personally invested. The amplification of the story through social media generated intense public pressure on both the police and the hotel. Protesters organized vigils and marches outside the Crowne Plaza Chicago O'Hare, sometimes numbering in the hundreds. Television cameras captured the gatherings, showing family members alongside community activists demanding transparency. The chants, "Justice for Kenneka," became a rallying cry that echoed in news broadcasts across the country. Mainstream media outlets soon framed the case as part of a larger narrative about race, policing, and trust. CNN, NBC, and CBS covered not only the facts of the investigation but also the mistrust of official accounts within communities of color. Commentators on cable talk shows noted that the family's frustration reflected a broader skepticism about whether young black women's disappearances were treated with the urgency they deserved. The medical examiner's October 6th ruling of accidental death did little to quiet the response. On social media, many users dismissed the report outright, arguing that it failed to address what they perceived as irregularities. Others circulated speculative theories that Jenkins had been lured into the freezer, that hotel staff or other guests were involved, that evidence was missing. These theories were not supported by official findings, but their spread revealed the extent to which the official narrative failed to satisfy public curiosity or skepticism. The imagery of the surveillance footage played a powerful role in shaping public response. Clips showing Jenkins stumbling alone through the hotel hallways and kitchens circulated widely, often stripped of their timestamps or context. For some viewers, the footage underscored her vulnerability and the plausibility of an accident. For others, the gaps in coverage and the absence of the crucial moment when she entered the freezer became proof of a cover-up. In both directions, the release of the video intensified, rather than diminished, debate. Newsrooms faced their own challenges. Reporters covering the case had to balance the need to report verifiable facts with the demand to address what was happening on social media. Many stories included references to online speculation, acknowledging its influence while cautioning readers against unverified claims. At the same time, the sheer volume of public interest kept the case in headlines far longer than most local tragedies. The family's grief was often on public display, becoming part of the media narrative itself. When Teresa Martin appeared before cameras, whether outside the hotel during vigils or at press conferences, her raw expressions of loss resonated deeply with viewers. Networks repeatedly aired her words, "I want answers. I want justice for my baby." Her presence kept the story human, ensuring it was not reduced solely to abstract debates about evidence and procedure. Community leaders and activists in Chicago connected the case to broader issues of systemic inequality. Figures involved in local movements against police misconduct and for racial justice took part in the protests, linking Jenkins' death to ongoing struggles for accountability. This framing ensured that the case was not viewed in isolation but rather as part of a pattern of institutional failures disproportionately affecting marginalized communities. The prolonged detention also spurred coverage in outlets not usually focused on local crime. The New York Times published a feature exploring the intensity of online theories and the difficulty for authorities in addressing them. International media, from the BBC to Al Jazeera, ran pieces explaining how a single death in a suburban American hotel had become a global conversation about race, justice, and digital rumor. As weeks turned into months, the case transitioned from breaking news to an enduring story revisited on anniversaries and in follow-up investigations. True crime programs and podcasts devoted episodes to Jenkins' death, often combining official information with speculative commentary. Documentaries reference the case as an example of how social media transforms public perception of criminal investigations. Even years later, when the wrongful death lawsuit reached a $10 million settlement in 2023, the coverage reignited. Headlines emphasized the size of the settlement and quoted family attorneys, while noting that the hotel and security companies admitted no wrongdoing. The news revived old footage, old chants, and old questions, reminding readers that for much of the public, the case had never been resolved in spirit, even if it was legally and medically closed. The public response to Kenneka Jenkins' death reflected more than curiosity about a tragedy. It demonstrated how digital platforms could amplify suspicion, how communities mobilized around unanswered questions, and how the press navigated the tension between fact and perception. For officials, the case was closed within 6 weeks. For the public, it remained open-ended, a story that lived on in hashtags, vigils, documentaries, and collective memory. The public response to Kenneka Jenkins' death was not confined to vigils and formal news reports. Much of it unfolded in the unruly, fast-moving ecosystem of the internet, where suspicion of institutions found fertile ground. In the days following the discovery of her body, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and Instagram filled with posts dissecting every scrap of available footage, every witness statement, and every police press release. On Facebook, where some of the original live videos from the hotel party had been streamed, users replayed and analyzed them as though they were pieces of forensic evidence. Comment sections filled with theories. Some believed background noises suggested a struggle. Others thought reflections in mirrors or sunglasses revealed hidden participants. None of these claims were substantiated by official investigations, yet the pace at which they spread meant they became part of the collective conversation. YouTube creators uploaded hour-long breakdowns of the surveillance footage, slowing frames and pointing to what they argued were inconsistencies. Some insisted that the video had been tampered with, citing glitches as evidence of editing. Law enforcement explained that these jumps were the result of how the hotel's surveillance system stored footage, recording in intervals rather than continuous streams. But the technical explanation did little to slow speculation. In fact, the more officials explained, the more skeptics felt their doubts confirmed. Twitter amplified the story to a national and global audience. Hashtags like #Kenneka Jenkins and #JusticeForKenneka trended repeatedly in September 2017, as users shared links to local news, clips from vigils, and their own interpretations of events. Activists and everyday users alike framed the case within a broader discourse on how missing Black women and girls often fail to receive the same urgency as white victims in similar circumstances. This missing white woman syndrome, as media scholars called it, was invoked by commentators who pointed out how quickly Jenkins' case faded from national television compared to others. Despite the immense online interest, the official response to this wave of online theorizing was uneven. Rosemont police released edited segments of video footage to the public on September 15th, attempting to quell speculation by showing Jenkins walking alone through hallways and into the hotel's lower levels. But the manner of release, silent clips lacking timestamps and sometimes showing abrupt transitions, only heightened suspicion for many viewers. Some activists accused authorities of deliberately withholding or altering evidence. Police denied those accusations, but by then, the gap between official explanations and public belief had widened into a chasm. Mainstream media outlets had to navigate this divide. Reporters from the Chicago Tribune, WGN, and NBC Chicago filed daily updates, quoting both police officials and family members. But they also faced pressure to address what was trending online. Some articles took on the task of fact-checking viral claims, clarifying, for instance, that there was no evidence of Jenkins being assaulted on camera. Others sought to explain technical details, like how walk-in freezers operated or how toxicology reports were interpreted. Yet the very act of engaging with rumors gave them a kind of legitimacy, keeping them alive in the public imagination. Coverage extended beyond traditional outlets. Blogs and independent digital publications, some focused on social justice, others on conspiracy culture, adopted the story and gave it new life. On platforms like Reddit, threads stretched into thousands of comments, with users treating the case as a collective investigation. Maps of the hotel were drawn, timelines reconstructed, theories exchanged. For many participants, Jenkins' death was no longer simply a news event but an ongoing puzzle to solve. Community leaders in Chicago recognized the power of this attention and used it to organize physical demonstrations. At protests outside the Crowne Plaza, activists invoked the online conversations as proof of widespread support. Speakers with megaphones referenced viral videos, telling crowds that the world is watching. The cycle was self-reinforcing. Online speculation fueled on-the-ground protest, which in turn generated more news coverage, which circled back into online debate. The scale of public response also drew in civil rights organizations and commentators. Some noted that the skepticism surrounding the case reflected a deep-seated mistrust of law enforcement among African American communities in Chicago and beyond. The history of strained relations between police and these communities meant that even an officially straightforward case, an intoxicated teenager wandering into a freezer, was never going to be accepted without question. The case became shorthand in conversations about how institutions communicate or fail to communicate with the public in moments of crisis. For the family, this public response was both a source of support and of pain. On one hand, the outpouring of attention ensured that their daughter's death was not dismissed or forgotten. Vigils were well attended, donations poured in, and Kenneka's name became widely known. On the other hand, the constant speculation created additional stress. Martin sometimes addressed conspiracy theories directly, asking the public not to invent scenarios but to focus on seeking transparency from officials. But once released into the digital sphere, the narrative could no longer be controlled. The media's long-term handling of the case reflected this complexity. Television networks produced anniversary segments, interviewing family members about their ongoing grief. Newspapers revisited the story in the context of the wrongful death lawsuit, framing the $10 million settlement as both resolution and reminder of unanswered questions. True crime series, from podcasts to streaming documentaries, retold the story with varying degrees of fidelity to verified facts. In some versions, the emphasis was on systemic failures. In others, the focus drifted toward speculation and mystery. The enduring public response revealed how Kenneka Jenkins' death had become more than an isolated tragedy. It became a cultural reference point, an example of how quickly information and misinformation could circulate, how distrust in institutions could shape perception, and how a grieving family's fight for answers could resonate far beyond their immediate community. Even after the official investigation was closed, the public conversation remained alive, evolving with each new anniversary, each new lawsuit development, and each new documentary retelling. The death of Kenneka Jenkins did not end with the closure of the police investigation in October 2017. While officials declared the matter resolved as an accidental death caused by hypothermia, the family and their attorneys pursued a different path, one rooted in the legal system. What followed was a years-long process of litigation, negotiations, and eventual settlement that highlighted the unresolved tensions between official narratives and the family's sense of injustice. The first significant legal action came in December 2018, when Teresa Martin, Jenkins' mother, filed a wrongful death lawsuit in Cook County Circuit Court. The lawsuit named the Crowne Plaza Chicago O'Hare Hotel, its parent company, and 2 security firms as defendants. In the filing, Martin alleged that negligence on the part of the hotel and its security staff directly contributed to her daughter's death. The lawsuit laid out the family's core claims: that the hotel failed to secure hazardous areas such as the unused kitchen and freezer, that staff and security personnel delayed their response to repeated requests from Martin and her relatives to search restricted spaces, including the kitchen area where Jenkins was ultimately found, that the hotel and its employees did not properly monitor surveillance footage, which could have located Jenkins sooner and potentially saved her life, that inadequate policies and training left guests vulnerable to danger within the premises. The defendants, for their part, denied liability. In their responses to the lawsuit, attorneys for the hotel and security companies argued that the circumstances of Jenkins' death were tragic but unforeseeable, and that their staff had acted within normal procedures. They emphasized that Jenkins had been intoxicated and disoriented, and that no evidence suggested hotel employees had directly caused or contributed to her entering the freezer. The lawsuit moved slowly, with multiple motions, hearings, and discovery processes extending the timeline. Attorneys for Martin pressed for internal documents, maintenance records, and training manuals related to the hotel's security policies. Depositions were taken from staff members who had worked during the night of Jenkins' disappearance, asking them to recount what steps were taken when Martin first arrived at the hotel and requested searches. As the case unfolded, the legal arguments mirrored the public controversies that had surrounded Jenkins' death since 2017. Where the police and medical examiner had concluded accidental death, the family's attorneys reframed the issue as one of premises liability, the responsibility of a business to protect guests from foreseeable harm. In that framing, it was not necessary to prove foul play or deliberate wrongdoing. It was enough to argue that proper safety measures could have prevented the tragedy. The litigation also revealed details not widely known to the public. In filings, attorneys referenced the safety release mechanism on the freezer door, questioning whether it was adequately illuminated or labeled, and whether Jenkins, impaired as she was, could reasonably have been expected to find and operate it. They scrutinized the timing of the searches, asking whether earlier access to restricted areas would have prevented Jenkins' death from hypothermia, which is a progressive condition. While the lawsuit proceeded, the case continued to surface in public memory. Each new development, a hearing date, a procedural ruling, a motion denied or granted, generated headlines in Chicago area news. Reporters interviewed legal experts who noted that wrongful death suits often hinge on demonstrating negligence rather than intent. The family's persistence kept the case alive in both the courts and the public eye. After years of legal maneuvering, the case reached a turning point in August 2023, when Cook County Court records revealed that the parties were preparing to finalize a settlement. By December 2023, Judge Thomas Cushing approved a $10 million settlement agreement between the family and the defendants. The settlement was divided among beneficiaries: Teresa Martin as Jenkins' mother, her 2 siblings, and the estate's attorneys. Legal filings showed that Martin was set to receive the largest share, reflecting her role as next of kin and the lead plaintiff in the suit. The hotel and security companies maintained their position of denying liability, framing the settlement as a pragmatic resolution to prolonged litigation rather than an admission of fault. For the family, the settlement was both a measure of accountability and an incomplete resolution. Martin expressed relief that the legal process had recognized the magnitude of her daughter's death, but she also reiterated that no financial award could replace Kenneka or fully answer the questions that lingered. "I still don't know why it happened the way it did," she told local reporters after the settlement was announced. The aftermath extended beyond the courtroom. The hotel, which had become the site of repeated protests in 2017, carried a tarnished reputation in the public imagination. Community members remembered it as the place where Jenkins had died and where answers had seemed elusive. Even after the settlement, online discussions frequently revisited the case whenever issues of missing Black women or suspicious deaths surfaced. Jenkins' name became shorthand for broader conversations about trust in institutions, particularly among communities who felt marginalized or disregarded. Media coverage of the settlement often revisited the original events, replaying surveillance clips and quotes from vigils. Documentaries and podcasts updated their episodes to include the outcome, framing the $10 million figure as symbolic of the seriousness of the claims. Yet they also underscored that because the settlement was not accompanied by an admission of wrongdoing, the same unresolved tensions remained. In legal terms, the conclusion of the wrongful death lawsuit marked the end of formal proceedings. But in cultural and social terms, the aftermath continued. Kenneka Jenkins' death remained a point of reference in conversations about premises liability, institutional accountability, and the power of social media in shaping narratives around tragedy. Her story was not simply a closed case, but an ongoing reminder of the gaps between official closure and public conviction. The path of the wrongful death lawsuit filed by Teresa Martin unfolded over nearly 5 years, revealing not only the family's determination but also the complexity of holding corporations accountable in court. The initial complaint, filed in Cook County Circuit Court in December 2018, contained nearly 50 pages of allegations. Attorneys argued that the Crowne Plaza Chicago O'Hare Hotel and its security contractors failed to exercise reasonable care to ensure guest safety. Specific allegations included leaving the freezer and kitchen area accessible to guests, failing to post adequate signage or barriers, neglecting to monitor restricted spaces, and delaying a full search even after Martin pleaded for help. The defendants, the hotel, owned by Rosemont Hotel LP, and 2 private security companies contracted for the property, quickly filed motions to dismiss. Their attorneys contended that Jenkins' entry into the freezer was unforeseeable and therefore outside the scope of reasonable duty. They emphasized her intoxication, arguing that no amount of staff vigilance could have predicted or prevented her specific actions. This early procedural battle foreshadowed the central tension of the lawsuit, whether the incident was an unforeseeable tragedy or a preventable hazard. The court denied some dismissal motions, allowing the case to proceed into discovery, a phase where evidence and testimony are exchanged. During discovery, Martin's attorneys sought access to maintenance logs of the freezer unit, surveillance archives from the hotel's security system, training manuals and employee handbooks regarding guest safety and missing persons, shift schedules and incident reports from September 8th to 10th, 2017. Depositions from hotel employees, including security staff, revealed the internal communication that took place on the day Jenkins went missing. Attorneys asked pointed questions about why staff did not search the kitchen earlier and whether any employee raised concerns about leaving areas like the freezer unsecured. Some employees reportedly acknowledged that staff discretion sometimes allowed for early access in emergencies, while others said they believed authorization from management or police was required. This inconsistency in testimony became a cornerstone of the family's argument that hotel policies were unclear, inconsistently applied, and therefore unsafe. Meanwhile, the defense attorneys pursued a different line. They emphasized Jenkins' blood alcohol concentration of 0.112 and the presence of topiramate in her system, pointing to her level of impairment. They argued that her actions could not reasonably have been anticipated by hotel personnel. Their filings often cited case law emphasizing that businesses are not insurers of guest safety, but are instead responsible only for reasonably foreseeable risks. The freezer, they contended, was not a reasonably foreseeable danger for a guest attending a party. Throughout 2019 and 2020, procedural hearings continued. The COVID-19 pandemic slowed court operations, prolonging the already drawn-out litigation. Still, attorneys for Martin pressed forward, submitting expert opinions from hospitality safety consultants who argued that hotels have an elevated duty of care when hosting large gatherings and that areas like freezers should be locked or clearly marked as restricted. The case reached a critical stage in 2021 when the court set a trial date. Pre-trial motions centered on whether certain pieces of evidence, such as surveillance clips and internal staff communications, would be admissible. The defense sought to exclude some testimony as speculative, while the plaintiffs fought to include all materials that shed light on decision-making in the hours Jenkins was missing. By 2022, settlement discussions had begun quietly. Court filings hinted at negotiations, though neither side publicly disclosed details. The family's attorneys argued that a settlement should reflect not only Jenkins' lost life, but also the emotional toll on her mother and siblings, who endured hours of uncertainty before her discovery. Finally, in August 2023, a proposed $10 million settlement was submitted to the court for approval. Judge Thomas Cushing reviewed the terms in a December 2023 hearing. According to court records, the allocation of the settlement included $3.7 million to Teresa Martin, $1.5 million each to Jenkins' two siblings, $3.5 million to attorneys' fees and litigation costs. The distribution reflected standard wrongful death settlements in Illinois, where next-of-kin beneficiaries receive compensation based on familial relationship and dependency. The judge's approval made the agreement legally binding, closing the case without a trial. The defendants, the hotel and security firms, continued to deny wrongdoing. Their attorneys described the settlement as a business decision to avoid the uncertainty of trial. Yet for the public, the sheer size of the figure was widely interpreted as acknowledgement that something had gone wrong. Headlines emphasized the payout, framing it as vindication for the family, even though no formal admission of liability was made. For Martin, the resolution was bittersweet. In interviews after the settlement, she said no amount of money could restore her daughter's life or erase the pain of not knowing precisely how events unfolded. She reiterated her belief that delays and negligence contributed to Kenneka's death, even if courts and police framed it as an accident. Her words echoed the emotional dissonance that had marked the case from the start. Closure on paper, but not in spirit. The aftermath of the lawsuit extended beyond the family. In legal circles, the case was cited as an example of how premises liability law can apply to unconventional hazards. For hotel operators, it underscored the importance of clear safety protocols, staff training, and proactive communication with families in missing person situations. Legal analysts noted that while the case was unique in its facts, its outcome reinforced the broader principle that businesses must anticipate risks beyond the ordinary. In the community, the settlement reignited discussion of Jenkins' legacy. Activists and supporters argued that while the legal system had provided some accountability, the larger systemic issues, delayed responses to missing Black women, the lack of trust in official narratives, the gaps in communication, remained unresolved. Online, hashtags resurfaced, with users noting that justice in financial terms did not erase the unanswered questions that had defined the case since 2017. The Jenkins family continued to honor Kenneka's memory through tributes and public statements. Her name became a reference point in campaigns demanding more urgent responses to missing persons cases, especially involving women of color. In this sense, the aftermath of the case was not only legal but also cultural, extending her impact far beyond the courtroom. The legacy of Kenneka Jenkins stretched well beyond the corridors of the Crowne Plaza Hotel where her life ended. In the years following her death, she came to represent an enduring symbol for families, activists, and communities who sought accountability and recognition for young women of color who died under circumstances they believed had not been taken seriously enough. Her name became a reminder of both grief and resistance, of loss and persistence. In Chicago and surrounding communities, Jenkins' death was remembered through vigils, marches, and commemorations held on anniversaries. Each year, mourners gathered to honor her memory, holding candles and photographs, reciting prayers, and speaking about the need for change. Community leaders used these gatherings as opportunities to highlight systemic issues: the lack of urgency in missing person cases, the insufficient training for hotel and security staff, and the broader failure of institutions to act with compassion when families raised alarm. These local gatherings ensured that Jenkins was not reduced to a file in a closed investigation but was remembered as a young woman whose absence left a void. Her case also made its way into courtrooms and legal education, where attorneys and professors discussed it in the context of premises liability law. Hospitality and security industries began citing the Jenkins case when discussing the responsibility of hotels to safeguard guests not only from typical dangers like slips and falls, but also from less obvious risks posed by unsecured restricted areas. Legal seminars referred to the case as a landmark example of how unexpected hazards could still be deemed foreseeable and therefore actionable under wrongful death claims. In law classrooms, students were asked to consider where the line should be drawn between a guest's personal responsibility and a business's duty of care. The hospitality sector was forced to reflect on its policies. Consultants who worked with hotels emphasized the need to secure all non-public areas, even if they were not routinely used. Some properties adopted stricter internal checks, requiring kitchens and freezers to be locked during downtime, or implementing clearer staff protocols for emergency searches. Though not officially mandated by law in every jurisdiction, these practices were understood by many managers as lessons learned from Jenkins' death. For those in the industry, her case became shorthand for a worst-case scenario that highlighted lapses in preparedness. The tragedy also had profound resonance in activist spaces, particularly those concerned with racial justice and women's safety. Organizers in Chicago tied Jenkins' death to a long pattern of African American families experiencing delayed or inadequate responses from law enforcement and institutions. Her case was cited alongside others where Black women had gone missing or died under disputed circumstances, becoming part of a broader campaign for systemic reform. Activists demanded changes in how hotels handle emergency requests from families, how quickly authorities respond to reports of missing persons, and how institutions are held accountable for inaction. Her legacy filtered into academic settings as well. In criminology and sociology courses, her case was taught as an example of how race, gender, and class intersect in matters of justice. Professors framed discussions around her death as an opportunity to analyze structural inequalities in response systems. Students read court filings and medical reports to understand how official narratives are constructed, then compared those with the voices of families who often feel unheard. In this way, Jenkins' story became part of the curriculum, a case study that grounded abstract discussions of justice in a real, lived tragedy. Cultural memory preserved her as more than just a case file. In public ceremonies, speakers often reminded audiences that Jenkins was a daughter, a sister, and a young woman with aspirations for her future. Teresa Martin, her mother, continued to speak publicly about her daughter, emphasizing her warmth, her personality, and the dreams cut short. For Martin, each public statement was not only about seeking justice, but also about ensuring that her child was remembered as more than the circumstances of her death. This humanizing force countered the tendency for high-profile cases to reduce victims to mere symbols. The settlement of the wrongful death lawsuit added another layer to her legacy. Though the $10 million agreement was not accompanied by an admission of liability, the figure itself carried symbolic weight. Legal commentators said it reflected the seriousness with which courts and corporations were ultimately compelled to treat the matter, even if official investigations had long since been closed. For many community members, the settlement validated what they had long felt, that Jenkins' death was not simply the result of chance but involved lapses in care and responsibility. In cultural terms, Jenkins' story has been preserved as both a cautionary tale and a call to action. Parents invoked her case when speaking to their children about safety and awareness in unfamiliar environments. Activists cited it when demanding reforms in corporate accountability and institutional transparency. Legal professionals discussed it in conferences about risk management. Each of these references ensured that her story lived on in multiple domains, as a lived tragedy, as a teaching tool, as a professional lesson, and as a moral reminder. What makes Jenkins' legacy particularly enduring is that it speaks to the intersection of personal tragedy and systemic challenge. Her death illuminated not only the fragility of one young life, but also the fragility of trust between communities and the institutions meant to protect them. Her name became part of a lexicon of cases that demanded attention to racial justice, gendered vulnerability, and corporate responsibility. Even years later, when her story is retold in classrooms, conferences, or community gatherings, the central message remains consistent. Kenneka Jenkins mattered. Her life and death carried implications beyond her family, reverberating through the ways people talk about accountability, justice, and the duty of care. That resonance is perhaps the truest measure of legacy, the persistence of memory in service of change. The enduring legacy of Kenneka Jenkins was measured not only in the grief of her family or the legal proceedings that followed, but also in the deeper institutional and cultural currents her case stirred. Her death became a touchstone for examining questions that stretched well beyond the specifics of one tragic night. What duty do corporations owe to the public? How should law enforcement respond to urgent pleas from families? And how do communities remember and protect those whose lives are cut short under preventable circumstances? One of the most tangible areas of impact was in policy discussions around missing person protocols. Though Jenkins was never officially classified as a missing person by law enforcement, the gap between when her mother reported her absence and when she was found became central to community demands. Advocates called for mandatory rapid response measures that would require police and private institutions, such as hotels, to treat such reports with urgency, even when intoxication was suspected. Legislators in Illinois and beyond debated whether new guidelines should be established for private venues, ensuring that families in distress could trigger broader searches without bureaucratic delay. While no statewide law directly stemmed from Jenkins' case, her death was repeatedly invoked in legislative hearings concerning the responsiveness of police and corporate entities in emergency situations. In the realm of wrongful death law, her case entered discussions among attorneys as a precedent for the scope of premises liability. Traditionally, liability claims against hotels centered on physical hazards, slippery floors, broken railings, or criminal acts occurring in inadequately secured spaces. Jenkins' case expanded this conversation, demonstrating that liability could also extend to non-traditional hazards, such as unmonitored restricted areas and the speed of staff response in emergency scenarios. Law review articles cited her lawsuit when considering how far the duty of care should extend, asking whether businesses must anticipate unlikely but catastrophic risks. Her case served as an example of how courts and corporations might be pressured to recognize vulnerabilities that, until then, were treated as outside the scope of foreseeability. Beyond the legal framework, her legacy lived on in the family-centered advocacy that Teresa Martin pursued. Martin did not allow her daughter's memory to fade into a line on a coroner's report. She appeared at community forums, vigils, and public gatherings, insisting that Kenneka's name remain alive in conversation. Her advocacy took multiple forms, pressing for hotel safety reforms, demanding accountability from law enforcement, and speaking directly to other families who had experienced similar tragedies. Through her persistence, Martin became not just the grieving mother of a victim, but a figure of moral authority who linked individual loss to systemic critique. Her visibility ensured that the tragedy remained humanized, not a puzzle of facts, but the loss of a young woman with family and future. The Jenkins case also highlighted the fragile balance of institutional trust in communities of color. In many African American neighborhoods of Chicago, her death reinforced the belief that official institutions too often fail to act decisively when Black lives are at risk. This was not merely about one incident. It tapped into decades of lived experience where families felt their voices carried less weight. In public forums, ministers, activists, and parents used Jenkins' name as shorthand for this mistrust. Her death became a rallying point, not because of conspiracy theories or speculation, but because it illustrated what many already believed, that the system was prone to delay, dismissal, and indifference. In educational settings, her story was woven into discussions of race, gender, and justice. Universities in Illinois and beyond used the case in courses on sociology, criminal justice, and public policy. professors asked students to analyze how structural inequalities shaped the outcome, from the moment Jenkins went missing to the way her family's pleas were handled. In nursing and medical ethics courses, the toxicology findings were discussed in the context of patient vulnerability and impairment. In legal seminars, her case was introduced as a practical example of how theoretical doctrines like duty of care and proximate cause unfold in real life. Through these diverse academic uses, Jenkins' story became a teaching tool, a way to anchor broad questions in the specificity of one young woman's life and death. Her legacy also permeated religious and spiritual communities. In churches across Chicago, pastors referenced her case in sermons about the value of life, the responsibility of institutions, and the importance of collective vigilance. Memorial services emphasized not only her passing but the call for reform it inspired. For congregants, her name symbolized both a local tragedy and a broader moral challenge, a reminder of how easily lives can be neglected when systems fail. Institutionally, the hospitality sector drew lessons from the case. Industry safety consultants cited Jenkins' death in conferences, reminding managers that responsibility extends beyond the obvious. Some hotels voluntarily tightened internal protocols, securing in-used freezers, improving surveillance monitoring, and drafting clearer emergency response policies. Insurance companies, which track risk for commercial properties, quietly noted the Jenkins settlement as an example of how unforeseeable incidents could still carry heavy financial consequences. Behind the scenes, this influenced how risk assessments were written and how liability coverage was structured. On the level of collective memory, Jenkins' name endured as part of Chicago's social landscape. Each anniversary of her death was marked by gatherings, newspaper retrospectives, and family statements. These commemorations reaffirmed her as more than a legal or medical case. They preserved her identity as a daughter, sister, and young woman whose life mattered, whose absence was still felt, and whose story continued to inspire reflection and action. Finally, the legacy of Kenneka Jenkins lay in the unresolved tension she left behind. Officially, her case was closed as an accident. Legally, it ended with a settlement but no admission of fault. Culturally, however, her story remained open-ended. It became a living narrative carried in memory, invoked in discussions of racial equity, institutional responsibility, and the meaning of justice. The persistence of her name years after her passing was itself proof of the depth of her impact. The death of Kenneka Jenkins became more than an isolated tragedy because it echoed so many familiar patterns in other cases across the United States. When communities compared her story to similar incidents, some in Chicago, others far beyond, they recognized repeating themes. Delayed responses, institutional failures, racial disparities, and unanswered questions that lingered long after official closure. One of the clearest points of comparison came from cases of missing and deceased young women in urban settings. In 2015, for example, the case of Alicia Walker, a black transgender woman from North Carolina, drew far less national attention than cases involving white victims of similar age. Advocates cited Jenkins' case alongside Walker's as evidence of an uneven urgency in both law enforcement and media coverage, showing how race, gender identity, and class shaped outcomes. The comparison highlighted a painful truth. Not every family's pleas are met with the same force or credibility, and not every victim's name is remembered equally. Closer to Chicago, Jenkins' story was often placed beside the disappearance of Diamond Bynum and her nephew King Walker, who went missing in 2015 in Gary, Indiana. Their family, like Martin, struggled with slow responses and a sense of being dismissed. Both cases illustrated how families of color often felt compelled to conduct their own searches, canvassing neighborhoods, knocking on doors, and organizing volunteers because institutional action was insufficient. In these comparisons, Jenkins' case was not unique but part of a larger pattern of families carrying burdens that should have been shared with official agencies. Her death was also discussed in the context of hospitality and safety failures. Legal analysts drew comparisons to cases where hotels or venues were sued for failing to protect guests from foreseeable harm. One parallel was the 1982 Hyatt Regency Walkway collapse in Kansas City, a structural failure that killed over 100 people. Though very different in scale, Both cases revolved around the duty of care businesses owe their guests. The Hyatt case reshaped engineering and liability standards, while Jenkins' case became a reference for securing restricted spaces and improving emergency responsiveness. Together, they showed how singular tragedies could force entire industries to confront hidden vulnerabilities. In conversations about race and justice, Jenkins' name was often invoked alongside Sandra Bland, who died in a Texas jail cell in 2015. Bland's case, officially ruled a suicide, was widely perceived by her family and community as mishandled, raising suspicions of foul play or negligence. Both Bland and Jenkins became symbols of systemic distrust, cases where official explanations did not satisfy the public, where families felt unheard, and where the community's skepticism reflected deeper histories of racial inequity. Neither case was resolved in a way that healed those wounds, underscoring the gap between institutional closure and community conviction. Another comparison often made was with Lauren Smithfields, a 23-year-old black woman who died in 2021 in Bridgeport, Connecticut, after meeting a man through a dating app. Police initially dismissed her death as accidental and did not immediately notify her family. Like Martin, Smithfield's mother and relatives spoke publicly about being ignored in their first desperate hours of searching for answers. Both cases highlighted how institutions sometimes frame victims' impairment or personal choices, intoxication in Jenkins' case, online dating in Smithfield's, as reasons to slow investigation. Advocates insisted that these contexts should never diminish the urgency of finding or protecting a missing woman. The broader lesson from these comparisons was the importance of equity in response. When white women such as Natalie Holloway, missing in Aruba, 2005, or Gabby Petito, missing and later found deceased in 2021, went missing, law enforcement responses were swift, and national media coverage was extensive. Jenkins' case, though highly visible in Chicago and in some activist circles, did not receive the same level of continuous national attention. Activists and scholars coined this disparity missing white woman syndrome and used Jenkins' case as a textbook example. It revealed how structural biases shaped not only investigations but also cultural memory, whose stories were amplified, whose were doubted, and whose faded quickly. From a legal and institutional perspective, Jenkins' case taught lessons that extended into risk management and corporate responsibility. Just as airlines overhaul procedures after crashes in schools, reevaluate safety after shootings, hotels and event venues were reminded that their obligations go far beyond surface-level amenities. Consultants warned that the cost of negligence was not only financial but reputational. A single death could define a property for decades. Jenkins' case became shorthand in legal circles for why proactive measures matter more than reactive explanations. The tragedy also illuminated the emotional toll of procedural delays. Families of missing persons, whether in Chicago, Gary, Bridgeport, or elsewhere, repeatedly described the anguish of waiting. Hours without answers, days without clear communication. Jenkins' mother often emphasized that the hardest part was knowing she had asked for help earlier and been denied access. This mirrored testimonies from countless other families who believed that earlier action might have changed outcomes. The broader lesson was that time is not neutral in emergencies. Every delay can carry life and death consequences. In educational and activist spaces, Jenkins' case became part of training curricula and public campaigns. Law schools taught it in tort classes. Criminal justice programs analyzed its procedural gaps. Advocacy groups cited it in petitions for reform. By comparing it with other tragedies, instructors and organizers illustrated that Jenkins' story was not an anomaly but part of a wider fabric of institutional shortcomings. Each comparison reinforced the broader call for systemic accountability, not just for one family, but for all families who suffer similar losses. Ultimately, the comparative lens showed that Jenkins' story was at once deeply personal and widely universal. Personal because it was about a single young woman with family, friends, and a future. Universal because it spoke to recurring issues across the nation. The vulnerability of women, the disproportionate neglect of women of color, the hidden dangers in public spaces, and the enduring mistrust between communities and institutions. Her legacy, placed alongside those of Bland, Smithfields, Holloway, Petito, and others, reminded the public that no tragedy stands alone. Each case was a chapter in an ongoing narrative about whose lives are protected, whose voices are heard, and whose justice is pursued with equal urgency. And in that larger story, the name Kenneka Jenkins continues to hold weight, not as an isolated accident, but as a symbol of the lessons society cannot afford to ignore. The death of Kenneka Jenkins found resonance not only in the immediate grief of her family, but also in the long arc of cases across the country where questions of safety, responsibility, and systemic oversight converged. To truly understand her legacy, one had to look at the wider landscape of tragedies with similar characteristics. Young people in compromised conditions, institutional delays, preventable hazards, and trace the patterns that emerged across time and geography. One strand of comparison came from cases involving restricted or hazardous spaces in public venues. In 2013, for example, a 17-year-old boy in Georgia, Kendrick Johnson, was found deceased inside a rolled-up gym mat at his school. Officials initially ruled his death accidental, suggesting he had reached for a shoe and become trapped. His family contested this version for years, claiming negligence and mishandling of evidence. While the specifics differed, both Johnson and Jenkins cases raised public suspicion about environments that were supposed to be safe and about how quickly authorities accepted explanations that minimized institutional liability. In both instances, families' dissatisfaction was not only about the deaths themselves but about the manner in which the official processes closed around them. Another area of comparison was in institutional response to intoxication or impairment. In 2009, a college student in Colorado, Carson Starkey, died from alcohol poisoning after fraternity members failed to seek timely medical help. His parents later campaigned for stronger Good Samaritan laws that encouraged calling for aid without fear of legal consequences. Though Starkey's case centered on peers rather than hotel staff, the core issue was the same: how institutions, whether fraternities, universities, or hotels, respond when someone is visibly impaired. In Jenkins' case, the medical examiner noted her blood alcohol concentration was above the legal driving limit. That fact, combined with her physical disorientation, should have signaled elevated vulnerability. The broader lesson was that impairment cannot be dismissed as personal recklessness. It increases the duty of care for those around. The medical legal implications of Jenkins' case were also compared to tragedies involving cold environments and accidental hypothermia. In Minnesota, several cases of college students wandering off in sub-zero conditions after nights of drinking had been documented. Medical examiners often ruled these deaths as accidents tied to hypothermia. What Jenkins' case added was the element of an artificial, man-made hazard, an industrial freezer that amplified natural risks. It raised legal and ethical questions about whether businesses have heightened obligations to control hazards that mimic natural dangers but exist under their supervision. In examining Jenkins' case alongside others, scholars also drew attention to patterns in emergency response. Time and again, families described initial reluctance from institutions to act. In 2012, the family of Mitress Richardson, a young black woman who disappeared after being released from a California sheriff's station late at night, reported that authorities were slow to mobilize. Months later, Richardson was found deceased in a remote canyon. The parallels with Jenkins' case lay not in geography or environment but in the sequence. Family insists on urgency, authorities delay, and later discovery brings closure without satisfying explanation. These echoes suggested a systemic underestimation of danger when families of young black women sounded alarms. Regionally, Chicago itself had seen other cases where vulnerable individuals encountered preventable harm in institutional settings. In 2014, a Chicago nursing home resident with dementia wandered from her facility and died of exposure. Regulators later cited the home for inadequate monitoring. Although she was older than Jenkins and in a medical care setting, the underlying theme was identical. When an institution assumes responsibility for vulnerable persons, it must take every possible precaution to prevent harm, even in scenarios that might appear unlikely. Comparisons also extended to the legal system's handling of settlements and accountability. Jenkins' $10 million wrongful death settlement stood in line with other high-profile payouts where institutions did not admit liability but nonetheless compensated families. This mirrored patterns seen in airline disasters, school negligence cases, and hospital malpractice suits. The lesson was consistent. Monetary settlements might bring financial relief and implicit acknowledgement of failure, but they rarely delivered the deeper sense of justice families sought. Jenkins' settlement, like many before it, highlighted the difference between legal closure and emotional closure. Culturally, her case was set against the backdrop of a broader American discourse about whose lives receive protection and recognition. Studies conducted by criminologists compared media and law enforcement responses across racial and gender lines. Jenkins' story fits squarely into findings that women of color often receive slower institutional responses and less sustained national attention than white counterparts in similar circumstances. The comparative framework underscored how systemic inequities were not isolated but recurrent, producing predictable disparities in urgency, credibility, and coverage. Beyond race, comparisons also focused on the psychology of institutional inertia. Whether in hospitals, schools, police departments, or hotels, staff often weighed potential liability, procedural hurdles, and reputational risks before immediate action. Jenkins' case provided a sobering example of how these calculations can delay responses precisely when time is most critical. Researchers in organizational psychology used her case as a study in how institutions prioritize self-protection over rapid aid, a pattern seen across industries. The broader lessons, when drawn together, were sobering. Jenkins' case, viewed alongside Johnson's gym mat death, Richardson's disappearance, Starkey's alcohol poisoning, and others, illuminated an American landscape where vulnerable individuals too often fall through institutional cracks. It showed how delays, dismissals, and underestimations compound risk. It demonstrated how the framing of impairment or behavior could be used to diminish perceived urgency. And it highlighted how settlements, though significant, could not fully repair the trust broken between families and institutions. Ultimately, these comparisons revealed that the Jenkins case was not just about one night in a Rosemont hotel. It was about the fragile link between individuals and the systems meant to safeguard them. It was about the uneven distribution of urgency and credibility. And it was about the recurring need to transform tragedies into catalysts for systemic change, lest the same lessons be learned again at the expense of another family's loss. This is the story as we see it. What do you think happened? Let me know in the comments. For more mysteries like this, subscribe to Eternal Obsidian.